Welcome to the Dynasty Market Watch. This is Monday morning wide receiver, where I give my interpretation of the wide receiver market and the tiers. Typically takes a few days for trade calcs and trade charts to kind of catch up with the actual market. So my goal here is to give you some stats from week 3 and year to date, and just give an outlook on my perception of the wide receiver trade market as you're making offers or as you're receiving offers and you're saying, okay, what is this guy actually worth? I don't think KTC is keeping up correctly, or whatever trade calculator you use. Let's run through it. This is Monday morning wide receiver.
Yesterday's price is not today's price.
This is also going to be available on YouTube. I've got a visual of all of the players and each of their tiers. So if you want to be able to see that, head over to YouTube, Dynasty Market Watch. Superstar tier 1 remains unchanged with Justin Jefferson and CeeDee Lamb, but man, it is getting tough to justify keeping Neighbors out of this tier. I'm going to go ahead and say we're like a week away from putting Neighbors up here. If he can do one more performance like he had yesterday, we'll be including him in this group. And CeeDee Lamb, I mean, he's kind of been struggling to start the season off. He's sitting at just an 18% target share so far, 14 points per game. It's getting tougher to justify. Justin Jefferson, on the other hand, continues to do what Justin Jefferson does. He's going nowhere. He is solidified in the superstar tier. I don't care what he does the next couple of weeks. He is in tier 1. As we move down to tier 2, this is where we get our first upgrade, and Malik Neighbors jumps into tier 2 with Jamar Chase and Amon-Ra St. Brown. Amon-Ra St. Brown had that rough week 1. Since then, he's been awesome. 30% target share this year. He's up to 16 points per game. Even with the emergence of Jamison Williams, Laporta's kind of been the one to take a massive step back in that offense. Amon-Ra St. Brown remains in tier 2. I've got these guys worth anywhere from 3 to 3.5 first-round picks. As a reminder, a first-round pick I'm valuing at about the 108, 109 range. I'm going to assume that the person trading the pick is probably attempting to make the playoffs, so I'm just going to value any sort of pick as a first in general as the 108. Jamar Chase, he plays tonight on Monday Night Football. Everybody's anticipating a big performance from him, with the Commanders' pass defense being one of the worst in the NFL. If he doesn't, that could kind of shatter his market value. I could see people moving Marvin Harrison Jr., Nico, maybe even Rashee Rice, who we'll get to in a minute, either up into this tier or moving Chase down into this tier, into the next tier, if he struggles. And we mentioned Malik Neighbors. He is wide receiver 1 overall through 3 weeks. Yeah, wide receiver 1. He's got a 35% target share, 45% of his team yards so far this year. He's been unbelievably good. You could go ahead and justify him into tier 1 if you wanted to. With Daniel Jones as his quarterback, I think that we could get into a position where there could be some growing pains along the way this season. But wide receiver 1 through 3 weeks, he's not having any problems with Daniel Jones currently. He's a stud. As we move down to the next tier, this is the elite tier. I'm calling these guys worth 2.5 to 3 first-round picks. We've got Marvin Harrison Jr., Nico Collins, Puka Nacua, and we've got Rashee Rice moving up into this tier, basically making him wide receiver 9 in Dynasty at this point. Puka is out, obviously, with the injury. There's really not much justification for the guys behind him being traded 1 for 1, even with the injury. But I could see someone preferring Nico, Rashee Rice, Marvin Harrison Jr. over Puka while he's hurt. And speaking of Nico, it's a little bit of a struggle in week 3 on the stat line, 4 for 86 in week 3. He still had 10 targets. He's leading the NFL in yardage, 113 yards per game. He's got CJ Stroud. There's really not much you can ask for. Marvin Harrison Jr., 26% target share this year. His catch rate this year is pretty horrendous at 45%. Seems like Kyler Murray's giving him some chances downfield to make some plays. And he has made some big plays. He scored 3 touchdowns through 3 weeks, which is kind of keeping him afloat at the wide receiver 12 mark. Week 3, he had a 32% target share. So big week 2 and 3 after a lackluster start to the career in week 1. Rashee Rice, probably the biggest mover of the year so far, jumping several tiers now here in week 3 in tier 3. So Rashee Rice, 32% target share. He's wide receiver 2 on the season. Guy's a stud. There's really not much any way around it. He's taking over the Travis Kelce role for that offense for Patrick Mahomes. He's going to be in this group for a long time. He's got an incredibly good situation. He and Mahomes just have it figured out together. If you can buy high, I wouldn't mind doing it at this price. Tier 4, Garrett Wilson and AJ Brown. I've got this group called Brink of Elite, but it is hard pressed to keep Garrett Wilson in this tier for much longer. He does have a solid target share at 27%. He and Rodgers just aren't in sync right now. One concern that you would have is that Garrett Wilson is heading to play the Broncos next week, so he's going to be facing off with Patrick Surtain. So I imagine it's probably going to get a little bit worse before it gets better for Garrett Wilson. If you're looking to buy, maybe wait a week, see what happens, and you might be able to pry him from the person that has him at maybe a 2 first cost. I imagine it's still going to be, even with a poor game against the Broncos next week, it would still probably cost you about 2 firsts. AJ Brown also in this tier had an unbelievably good week 1, had 5 catches for 119 yards and a touchdown. He's hurt right now. I don't think that there's really any reason to move him down because of the injury. It sounds like he'll probably be back for week 5 or week 6 at the latest. Sounds like he'll be back for week 4 or week 5 at the latest. Next group down, we've got the holding out hope for elite. And this group I've got worth about 2 firsts, and that's Chris Olave, Drake London, Devontae Smith. And these guys they're kind of the group of like, can you give us a little bit more, please? Olave's averaging the same amount of points as Garrett Wilson. So I could see someone saying, okay, why aren't they in the same tier? Olave's at a 22% target share. He's not dominating the offense as much as Garrett Wilson. Doesn't seem to be quite the focal point. So I do have him a tier, you can almost call it a half tier below Garrett Wilson. Devontae Smith took a massive hit in week 3. So it sounds like with a concussion, he probably is going to be out for week 4. That doesn't really impact anything here, but he has been pretty good so far this year. AJ Brown out has helped him in weeks 2 and 3, but I think that Devontae Smith has justified his position in this group. He's one of the most talented wide receivers in the NFL. It is a matter of the situation's not great. There's not a ton of volume in the offense, and he's playing the Robin role as the wide receiver too. Drake London's an interesting one. He's kind of been up and down throughout this short season so far, and 23% target share on the season. There's just something about him that just is, he doesn't look very athletic. He's not aesthetically appealing to me, but I think that he's remaining in this tier. He's kind of living off of the touchdowns he had in week 2 and in week 3. He and Cousins do seem to be getting on the same page a little bit more as we progress. He's at 13 points per game, wide receiver 22 on the season, but he had a 31% target share in week 3. So might be something to progress from here. He and Darnell Mooney seem to be the 2 key focal points for this offense. I'm remaining optimistic on Drake London, but at the price of 2 firsts or trying to tier up into the Marvin, Nico, Puka, Rashee Rice tier, I'm fine either way there. Next tier down is I'm calling the Glob but Cool range. And this is 1.5 to 2 firsts. You've got Brandon Ayuk, Jalen Waddle, who we've moved down a tier this week, George Pickens. Then you've got the 3 rookies, Brian Thomas Jr., Xavier Worthy, Rome Odunze. Brandon Ayuk had a 33% target share in week 3. He just caught 5 of the 48. He just caught 5 passes for 48 yards. Got to imagine he's struggling a little bit to get his footing after the holdout. If you have Ayuk, it has been concerning, but I would probably just hold for now. I'm not trying to tier down to the next groups. Obviously, if you can tier up, maybe add a second to go get Olave, London, or Devontae Smith. I would probably just be holding Brandon Ayuk for now. He may be entering into a little bit of a buy window if somebody's getting squeamish. Maybe you can move a DK who's been performing well recently, and we'll get to DK in a minute, but maybe he's justifying himself to move up a little bit. George Pickens, I think he's really talented. I think he's one of the better wide receivers that we have in the NFL. Unfortunately, his situation has to be one of the worst in the NFL with the low volume Justin Fields as his quarterback. I'm a little bit concerned about him right now. I could see moving him down to the glob if this continues. If you're a tanker or a rebuild, I don't mind just holding him with the hope that the volume increases in the future. Because if it ever does, he can be an elite wide receiver, and that's kind of why I'm holding him in this tier right here, because I think that he has the talent of some of these guys ahead of him, but his situation is pretty awful. Brian Thomas Jr. plays tonight against the Bills. Xavier Worthy, he is one that I don't really see much justification to have him where he's at right now. And I think the market's a little bit over their skis on him. He remains just pretty mispriced. He had 4 targets in week 3, just a 10% target share. And basically, if I remember correctly, basically all the targets were just kind of schemed. He's not doing much to get open. He's kind of living off of his primetime 2-touchdown performance in week 1. Roma Dunze is one that has moved up a tier, and he had a big week 3. He had 11 targets. He's got a 21% target share on the season. He had 6 catches, 112 yards, and a touchdown. That jumps him back up a tier after dropping him down into the glob last week. And as long as Caleb Williams' volume is up, I feel pretty optimistic about keeping him in this group. Same tier, but we're kind of just changing the type of player here, and that's Tyreek Hill. And it's another one that's tough to justify keeping him where we're at because of the Tua situation. As long as Tua comes back at some point, I'm fine keeping him in the 1.5 to 2 first range. I've got this tier called Old Potential Top 5 Season. You could also just call it the Cheetah tier. And then from there, we get into the glob. And the glob, as I've said before, these are guys that I really don't want to have. I'd much rather prefer moving into guys that I think could become elite. So we talked about some of the ones from earlier. I think that some of those guys could become elite, and that's the type of player that I want. And then also the other issue with the glob is that these guys just aren't really helping my teams win on a consistent week-to-week basis, besides maybe DK Metcalf. So DK has been cruising so far this year. He's had back-to-back strong performances. He's 6th in the NFL in total receiving yards with 262, 23% target share, which is fine, nothing too special. But his catch rate has been really strong. He and Geno Smith seem to be on the same page. On a fantasy points per game standpoint, he's wide receiver 7 on the year, wide receiver 8, kind of depending on if you want to include A.J. Brown and Cooper Kupp. He's been pretty awesome. So that offense seems to be moving a bit, and he's taken the lead as the wide receiver 1 ahead of JSN and Tyler Lockett. DK Metcalf could justify moving him up into that Brandon Ayuk, Jalen Waddle, Pickens range. I really wouldn't see any issue with that. Maybe 1 week away from going ahead and making that move. The other guys in the glob, you've got what we're calling the glob older, which is about a first and a second in value. The other guys here are T. Higgins, DJ Moore, Michael Pittman. T obviously is coming back from injury. He plays tonight against Washington. DJ Moore with Caleb Williams in that offense, it's been a bit of a struggle. He doesn't seem to be too thrilled about being paired up with Caleb Williams, and the stats are kind of falling in line. And then Michael Pittman, him with Anthony Richardson. I really want no part of that passing attack with Anthony Richardson at quarterback. And in the glob, the young range, also worth about a first, maybe a first and a second. You've got Zay Flowers, Tank Dell, JSN, Jamison Williams, Jaden Reed, Lad McConkey, and Jordan Addison. Jordan Addison, we don't need to run through. He's been hurt, but he does need to come back strong because people are starting to get a little bit bored of him, and it might create a buying opportunity. So if you can get him at maybe a first range, I wouldn't pay a first for him, but a player along those lines, maybe you can tier out of Michael Pittman, DJ Moore types and get into Jordan Addison, maybe T. Higgins and get Jordan Addison plus. Something like that would be interesting for me. Vlad McConkey, this volume in the Chargers offense has been horrendous. Everybody talked about it all offseason. I wasn't as inclined to believe it, but here we are. It is coming to fruition. They threw 20 times yesterday. You had a 30% target share, but when you have a 30% target share of 20, that's not great. That's just 6 targets. So this is going to be probably a low volume offense all season, and especially if Justin Herbert's hurt. Possible buy opportunity for Lad if you're a rebuilder. I wouldn't mind trying to get him. I think that he is talented, and he's obviously dominating what is of the Chargers offense. So I wouldn't mind looking into him. You got Jaden Reed. He had a 32% target share in week 3. He's emerging as the clear star of that wide receiver room. So possible buy low, final buy low opportunity for before Jordan Love returns in week 4. Jaden Reed seems to be the guy for the Packers. Jameson Williams didn't have a very good week 3, fell back to a 13% target share that week. And I'm probably just going to dismiss it and kind of move on. And, all of these guys in this range is why I don't like the Glob. They have a game every now and then where they just no-show. And that's what happened to Jameson Williams yesterday. And speaking of no-show, JSN as well. JSN, 20% target share on the season. He had just 3 targets in week 3 for a 9% target share. Not great. I don't think that it really impacts his status in the tiering at all. But I think that if he had another big game this week, maybe you justify moving him up into the Brian Thomas, Worthy, Pickens, Roma Dunze range. But this just kind of proves why he's in the Glob, because you just never really know. You can have lay an egg at any point. I will say this about JSN. For players that have played at least 3 games, he's got the second most fantasy points per game without a touchdown, only behind DJ Moore. So might be time for him to find the end zone, and that would really help kind of solidify his status in this tier. And if he can have some good games with a touchdown, that would kind of help give him the opportunity to jump up. Tank Dell, 15% target share on the season. He's just taking a backseat to Nico and Diggs, another guy that I'd be okay having on a tank, but on a contender, no thank you. Zay Flowers, he's kind of the whole passing attack in this Ravens offense. Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely have done nothing since week 1, and Rashad Bateman kind of seems to be an afterthought outside of the touchdown he scored in week 3. So it's kind of the Zay Flowers show in the passing attack for the Ravens. But this passing attack is a low volume offense, and they don't seem to be going downfield a whole lot. So there's not a whole lot of yardage there for Zay Flowers to be had. And in the next group, you've got the empty yield producers. And I'm calling them empty yield because you really can't get much for them on the trade market, but they are producing for your fantasy team. And week 3, Amari Cooper went off. He had 2 touchdowns. Stephon Diggs had a nice performance. He kind of stepped in for Nico as he and Stroud were having a tough time connecting. And then valued at the same price as the Glob at about a first and a second, we have our old guys, Devontae Adams, Deebo Samuel, Cooper Kupp, and Chris Godwin, all valued about the same at about a first and a second. Devontae had a big week 2, took another step back in week 3. Deebo's obviously hurt right now. Cooper Kupp is hurt right now. And then Chris Godwin, man, he's been good this year, and he continues to kind of take a step ahead of Mike Evans from that slot. Chris Godwin, a touchdown, and I think about 55 yards in week 3. I think he's earned the status of being alongside Devontae, Deebo, and Cooper Kupp. Not to mention that he might be the youngest from that group. I think he's 28. And then the empty yield producers, I've got valued at about 2 seconds. And I call them the empty yield producers because they're really not going to return you much on the trade market. They're probably better served just sitting on your contender team. We had Amari Cooper week 3. He had a strong game, bounced back after poor performances in week 1 and 2. So week 3, he had 2 touchdowns. Diggs, he kind of stepped in for Nico as he and Stroud struggled to connect. Mike Evans, like we mentioned before, he's taken a step behind Chris Godwin. I would expect he and Baker to start connecting, so I really don't have any issues keeping him in this group here. Kirk and Calvin Ridley, they're both hanging on by a thread for this group. And Keenan Allen injured. He had 11 targets in week 1. Might be a decent buy low opportunity for him. Maybe if you can send a late second if you need a start, or maybe if you can send a second if you plan to start him in week 4. He is coming off of the plantar fasciitis, so hard to say how impacted he'll be. And then Deontay Johnson, resurrected from the dead by Andy Dalton. 122 yards on 14 targets. As long as Andy Dalton's the quarterback, Deontay's going to be a great flex option. He had 38% of the team's targets in week 3. Week 1, he had a lot of the team targets before not playing in the fourth quarter. So Deontay Johnson, a strong option for a contending team. That wraps up Monday morning wide receiver. The guys that we're going to keep an eye on: Malik Neighbors, can he move into tier 1? Rashee Rice, if he can keep doing what he's doing, we may be moving him up another tier next week. Garrett Wilson, keep an eye on him. If he can't figure it out, we may be moving him down. Ayuk might be a buy low opportunity for him, like we talked about. People are a little bit uncomfortable with how he's been playing. Pickens, I can see moving down at some point. And then DK, if he can continue performing like a true wide receiver 1, we may be moving him up. I'm Todd. You can find me on Twitter at DynastySFlex. Thanks for joining.
The number on this jersey is the quote price.